IVM.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. You're listening to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya Pareek. Before we begin, I'd just like to mention that admissions are now open for Takshashila's Graduate Certificate in Public Policy programs. If the topic of today's episode interests you, do check out our course in Defense and Foreign Affairs. To know more, click the link in the show notes. Coming to today's topic, India recently came out with its finalized Arctic policy document. An expansive publication spanning about 27 pages, it casts a wide net and explains India's priorities, objectives, and course of action for the Arctic. To discuss the Arctic region, India's approach to it, and the current landscape of international cooperation related to the Arctic, I have with me today Alexandre Delangle. Alexandre is currently a Ph.D. student at Université Paris-Saclay, focusing on, among other things, the militarization of the American Arctic, 1932 to 1950s. He currently lives in Michigan, USA, and works as a teaching assistant at the Albion College. Welcome, Alexandre.
Hi, Aditya. Thank you very much for having me.
So to start with, could you give our listeners a brief overview of how the international community engages over the Arctic, the governance of the region, the security, the scientific cooperation there?
Yes, certainly. I'll try to be brief, but I think we need to talk a bit of the Cold War and how the Arctic governments emerge from that situation of strong competition in the Arctic. But to summarize first on how the international community engages in the Arctic, I think we have to mention that since the end of the Cold War until last month, the international community engaged in the Arctic under the principle that cooperation in one of the most fragile ecosystems in the world outweighs violent confrontation. So, of course, we could describe the attitude of some states, like newcomers with great ambitions, for instance. We could describe these attitudes as a competition for cooperation, for instance. But so far, the militarization of the Arctic is firstly motivated by national industrial defense purposes. There has been provocations and a lot of chest puffing and chest stomping as well, like the resumptions of Russian Arctic air patrols in 2007. But threats to national securities remain low so far. And waging war in the Arctic is certainly not a priority, especially right now. So over the past decade, we heard many pundits calling the Arctic a lawless El Dorado, for instance, but we need to keep in mind that in order for the Arctic to develop, in order for businesses to develop in the Arctic, stability and law are needed. And all the Arctic states know this perfectly well. We can mention as well that 90% of the oil and gas reserves are already located inside national borders. So there is no need to wage war in the Arctic for new lands, for instance. Even though there are claims to extend exclusive economic zones, the resources are already in sovereign borders. Also mention that there is no real capabilities for an armed conflict in the Arctic, at least on land. But to precise this and to be more specific and have some insights about how the Arctic states behave in the Arctic, I think it's very important to have a brief look at the perspective over the Arctic. And I won't talk too much about the European Arctic nations. Let's just consider that to them, the Arctic is just their home. I want to start with the elephant in the room, meaning Russia. So Russia, just by geography, its demographic, is certainly the first Arctic power. And due to its history and exploitation of its polar territories, it sees the Arctic as both the place of past national heroes, it's also a place of present technical innovations, but it's also a place of future great treasures. If we mention, for instance, the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, so it's an administrative consideration of the Arctic territory in the Russian Federation, this region holds 80% of Russian gas production and 20% of its crude oil production, 20% of its federal exports, and 10% of its GDP. So we definitely understand why Russia wants to defend this area, but doesn't want to wage war waging war in the Arctic would be nonsensical. So, of course, to Moscow, sovereignty is the key matter in the Arctic. If we were to mention Canada, for instance, we can safely say that Canada will somehow share this concern over sovereignty with Russia, because Canada is still a very young country that emerged in 1865 as an autonomous and independent country. It always has been worried about American incursions in the high north that could question its own territory, if not its existence. So, to Canada, the Arctic is large, extremely difficult to defend, and hence there is this decision to agree to disagree with the US on the legal status of the Northwest Passage, for instance, and also a certain Canadian mistrust against NATO that is somehow seen as a Trojan horse that would, how could I say, that would infiltrate other armies in the Canadian North, meaning a territory that is difficult to master and to defend. As for the US, I think we can't go without mentioning its nickname of a reluctant Arctic nation. That comes from the fact that Washington always has developed a limited interest for the Arctic. And when it has developed an interest for the Arctic, it was for non-Arctic reasons, like fighting the Nazis in Greenland or the Japanese in Alaska during World War II, competition with the Soviet Union that encourages deployment in Canada and Greenland during the Cold War. Just like modern-day competition with Russia and China is encouraging in the US a new interest for the region that is illustrated by the publication of Arctic policies by all American armed forces agencies over the last 3 years. So, considering this, I think we can now address the matter of the emergence of Arctic governments. So, Arctic governments, at least until spring 2022 and the war in Ukraine, the Arctic and its regional cooperation has been exemplary, as all actors did their best in order to prevent any non-Arctic matter to spill over the Arctic governance, to the point that there is an expression that has been lauded and used by many academics that there would be an Arctic exceptionalism. And so because it was born in the Cold War as an initiative that focused on what was common between the Arctic states rather than on what was driving them apart, we can clearly understand the key idea that without a dialogue between Russia, that holds 50% of the Arctic territory, and Western nations, Arctic governments is becoming, how could I say, shallow or hollow, just a husk if Russia is not included. So if we were to look at the reasons why such a government was possible before the end of the Cold War, we have to consider the fact that the Soviets needed help when it came to manage their nuclear waste. So during the Cold, the Arctic was the most nuclearized region in the world. It is still nowadays the most nuclearized region in the world, both on the military and the civilian side. However, when we consider the famous speech of the former Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who popularized the expression of the North Pole as a pole of peace during its Moments speech of 1987, we can really understand through this speech that the Soviet needed help with both the nuclear waste, but also wanted foreign investments in order to develop their resources and open an Arctic route. So a few years later, in 1991, we had a Finnish initiative that led to the signature of the Arctic Environment Protection Strategy by the 8 Arctic countries. And 5 years later, we had, in 1996, the Ottawa Declaration that established the Arctic Council. So the Arctic Council is the main governance body of the Arctic. It is the central governance system and maybe the most interesting to us today. The Arctic Council is a forum. It's not an organization. It's an intergovernmental forum that is composed of 8 state members, which prime focus is the study and protection of the environment of the Arctic. And because the AC, the Arctic Council, is not an organization, it doesn't make nor execute laws. It prepares drafts that could be turned into agreements later about responsibilities that would be signed by all members of the Council. But let's be clear, if a member of the Council was not to respect or not to obey these regulations, the Council would not have any mean to impose sanction over this state, for instance. So all these regulations initiated by the Council are voluntary. There has been this expression in the media that these agreements that were concluded among the Arctic Council are binding. It's not exactly the case, not as we generally understand as a treaty to be binding between all its parties. Like I said, sanctions are absent from these treaties and from these agreements. Moreover, there is something that is quite important in this Arctic Council, is that hard security issues cannot be addressed at this forum, only soft security issues, or more precisely, human security issues. Meaning that for the Council, the referent for security is not the national level, but the human level, with a focus on food, health, political, economic, and, for instance, environmental security, especially environmental security. And on this matter, the contribution of the permanent members of the Arctic Council, meaning indigenous associations. These indigenous associations that are of the number of 6 are decisive. However, even though they are part in the decision-making, they are consulted, they are respected, the AC, the Arctic Council, is clearly a stage for them to express their concerns. They do not have a voting right. They cannot vote during the AC sessions, despite their much needed knowledge in tackling a changing Arctic and tackling climate change in general. So to conclude on the Arctic Council, I just want to stress the fact that the backbone of the Council is its scientific basis. It is composed of 6 working groups, which improve our understanding of the fauna and the flora, on how to intervene in case of industrial crisis, for instance, in the region, or even on how to develop the region's resources without damaging it. So to put it simply, the AC's main purpose is to inspire and achieve political progress through science, and has provided the structure for negotiation of 3 agreements that I mentioned earlier. So we had an agreement on search and rescue in 2011. We had an agreement on oil pollution and preparedness and response in 2015, and a third one on scientific cooperation in 2017. So to have a seat at the AC means being part of the future of the Arctic and of its economic development. This is why the Arctic Council has caught the eye of several nations applying for an observer status. So far, we have 13 states being observer at the Arctic Council, and among them, we can find Japan, for instance, South Korea, Singapore, China, but also India, that gained this observer status in 2013.
Interesting. I really like the fact that you focused a bit on Canada and the friction that kind of it has with the US, and specifically the friction over FONAVs and that sort of a stuff. And I really like the characterization, that Trojan horse kind of a thing. Yeah, that's really interesting. And thank you so much for this expansive answer. So let's move on to India's policy document that came out on the 17th of March recently. And that really was the highlight for me, at least last month. So let's talk about the key sections of that document that caught your eye.
So I'll start by saying that the India's Arctic policy relies on 6 pillars. So this is clearly stated in the document. The 6 pillars are science and research, climate and environmental protection, economic and human development, transportation and connectivity, governments and international cooperation, national capacity building. So if I had to select the 2 most important elements of this policy that would pave the way for India's future in the Arctic, I would definitely mention the sharing of India's ambitious space program that is supervised by the Indian Space Research Organization and its cooperation with the Arctic Data Infrastructure in the Arctic that unites the 8 Arctic countries' mapping agencies. I write the extract I'm referring to. It's on page 12. It's relatively short. India's regional navigation satellite system has been accepted by the International Maritime Organization as a component of the worldwide radio navigation system. The IRNSS system is also available for assisting in the safety of maritime navigation in the Arctic. The NASA ISRO-SAR, so the NISA mission, will launch its first satellite in 2023. It will measure the Earth's changing ecosystems, dynamic surfaces, and ice masses. This will, inter alia, provide information about biomass, natural hazards, sea level rise, and groundwater. NISA's data will help better understand the causes and consequences of land surface changes and the effects of pace of climate change. This will enable better management of natural resources and hazards globally, including in the Arctic. And last point, that is, again, very important to me, the Arctic is characterized by low digital connectivity. India's expertise in providing effective satellite-enabled communication and digital connectivity in remote areas can potentially fill these gaps. To me, this is huge. To me, this is the key of India long-term engagement in the Arctic, because this will be extremely appreciated by Arctic nations, and this will be popular among the Arctic populations. So if India fulfills its promise of making its space data open to the public, it will enable a considerable amount of business opportunities in maritime safety, in connectivity, but also in resources management. Something that is linked to this matter that I particularly appreciated, I think you talked about it earlier in one of your threads, it was about this mention of India as the pharmacy of the world pharmacy, I believe. So yeah, I'm very intrigued by this concept of pharmacy of the world and the way that India provides healthcare nationally, because this could be extremely appreciated in remote communities, I believe, especially in Canada and Russia. If I had to now to speak a second point, I would say that the other most decisive choice of the Indian government is the commitment to finally acquire Apollo research vessel. After almost 10 years of waiting and developing the industrial capacity of constructing more of them nationally, because Apollo research vessel is capable of autonomously operate both in the Arctic and the Antarctic and provide assistance to researchers on the ground via, for instance, an embarked laboratory or a helipad, for instance. Overall, I would say that the humble approach and of India in this Arctic policy that is not self-assuming an Arctic identity will be appreciated, and this emphasis on sci-tech cooperation could make India a new Arctic player and an important one in the decades to come, if the Indian companies are ready to invest in the region. And maybe that's one of the caveats of the document. Maybe we do not have enough concrete offers, maybe not as well enough concrete references to India's researchers, think tanks, businesses that could operate in the region. And maybe I'm biased on this, but I would say maybe not enough mentioning of social sciences as well, and not just hard sciences.
Indeed. And I actually agree with most of your observations, but I do have a few things to add. Even if a little pedestrian, I really have to say that India's interests are mainly scientific. And in fact, to put it a bit more, for the layman, we're out there to only study natural phenomena. So in hard sciences terms, as you mentioned, that would be meteorology, the weather watching. And, in fact, I had this question when I was interacting with an academic. He asked me a question. So he's from Russia. He asked me, is this the first white paper by the Indian government on the Arctic? So, well, when you characterize a white paper, it comes out as a policy document or a very long communique which lays out the vision of the government and the development status and that sort of a thing. But India did, in fact, when it joined the AC, the Arctic Council, in 2013 as an observer, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs published a long note. It's about 1,000 words or so, explaining what India's approach and interest is in the Arctic. So there's this specific excerpt that I remember, which pretty much puts down what we're looking at there. So the hypothesized teleconnections between the Arctic climate and the Indian monsoon. That encapsulates exactly, the stakes for India in the region. Because as the latest Arctic policy document that we're talking about mentions, India's main focus there is to secure its sustainable development goals back home. So the weather watching, the ice melting, the permafrost thawing, all of that stuff that we're studying in the Arctic has a direct impact on the food security back home. So ensuring that our economic development doesn't stymie, a key part of that would be India's engagement in the poles. And that connects really to things that, our initiatives like characterizing the Himalayas as a third pole. So the idea again is weather watching, is again predicting the monsoon in the Indian Ocean region. So India's primary interests and then capacity building in terms of, like you mentioned, reiterating the ambition of building polar ice class research vessels. So that actually all ties back into it. But, I also have a few things that I should really make specific mention of. So, for example, the space engagement section in the policy, I think India's focus on its private space sector has been one of those glowing points of the government right now. So I think it's kind of in bad taste that the government space agency ISRO's logo was plastered all over that section. So really, I think it could have been handled a bit better. National capacities and the government's capacity is definitely the primary driver of policy and engagement in the region. That's definitely how it's going to be. But I think India has focused quite a bit on liberalizing its space sector and trying to get in the new space companies, the private to space companies, the startups. So the idea that they hardly find any mention, there's very, token mention of inviting the private sector. I think it could have been handled better. So that's one of the small criticisms that I have for the policy. And I think the fact that in January 2021, this policy actually saw a draft consultation. It was published for a draft consultation. And we at Takshashila actually did send comments on that draft. So I think that consultation and the publication of similar strategic documents from around the world, especially the EU's, I remember, again in summer 2021, I think a clear imprint of that document is also on India's policy. So I think it evolved quite a bit. And again, coming to the polar ice class research vessels, I think we've already talked about Russia. So I think as a specific recommendation, I think Russia has the best to search and rescue umbrella and the security umbrella in the region, in my personal opinion. And as you said, the nuclearization of the Arctic, I think Russia is the biggest player in that sphere if you talk about it. So I think Rosatom float, the nuclear icebreakers that they operate are pretty much the perfect template on which India should be thinking of making its ice class vessels, really, because they have almost unlimited range as far as the propulsion is concerned. So I think as a one-stop solution, that might be the template to look at. So let's move on a bit and let's talk about Himalayas as a third pole that we've already touched on a bit. So would you like to weigh in first?
Oh, sure. What I found, and this is a nice progress that we can attribute this success and this evolution partly to Indian scientists, is that in 2007, the IPCC assessment report referred the Himalayas as a white spot, not because of the color of the snow, but mostly because of a dramatic lack of data. And afterwards, other documents of the UN published in the following years stated that the unpredictable transformation of the glaciers could have impactful outcomes. So when we consider the Himalayas, we must keep in mind that just like the Arctic, the third pole is warming at a faster rate than the rest of the planet. And this is where Indian and regional scientists stepped in and granted legitimacy to the people of the third pole. Because after all, the third pole is Asia water tower. It provides water to almost 1 billion of people who rely on these resources, for either sanitation, drinking, food production, and hydroelectric power on both India and China side, for instance, of the mountains. So what is important to keep in mind is that the magnitude of the catastrophes provoked by a climatological disturbance could be monumental due to the irregular water flows. Could also think of water shortages, for instance, disruptions of the monsoons that provide 70% of India's precipitation, which is, of course, a much needed phenomenon for India's agriculture. We can also mention the risk of violent glacial outburst floods this risk truly connects the people of the Arctic and the ones linked to the Himalayas. I believe it's the kingdom of Bhutan that actually considers these glacial outburst floods as its most serious national threat. So considering how important the melting of the glaciers can be for human security, we understand better why India has been welcomed by Iceland and its Arctic Circle Forum, for instance, between 2011 and 2013, before integrating the AC. We can also understand better why in 2019, the Hindu-Kush Himalaya assessment report has been acclaimed by the international scientific community, and as well why on that same year, the IPCC special report on the ocean and cryosphere did include the high mountain cryosphere in its data and conclusions. So the links between the two locations have been explained pretty well by the scientific community, and actually the influence and interconnection can be seen in the name of the Hindu-Kush Himalayan Monitoring and Assessment Program, which was inspired by one of the Arctic Council Working Group, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. And this matter of the third pole, again, goes beyond India and its neighboring countries, because in Europe, we can see this parallel with the Alps. If we consider the landlocked country of Switzerland that is calling the Alps the third pole as well, just like the Himalayas, we can understand better how Switzerland managed to get a seat at the Arctic Council. We can also understand better why Switzerland is calling itself the vertical Arctic country, and how Switzerland just joined the Arctic Council in 2017, which was actually the only state to be accepted as an observer at the Arctic Council, unlike Greece, Turkey, and Mongolia, which applications were rejected. So indeed, Switzerland not only benefits from a prosperous industry, but also from a long history of polar explorations, in addition of its location in the high altitudes. We can understand now why there is a need from the Arctic countries, from the scientific community, to welcome other countries that are non-Arctic, but which have, how could I say, a great experience and a great knowledge in melting glaciers, for instance, or a great experience in change in high altitudes.
Indeed. And I think one key point that India's Arctic policy also has about to the Himalayas, and I think we also saw a very similar thing with how the EU's document also talked about, concerns about to biosecurity and such. So I think the very same thing applies to, the Arctic and the third pole, the Himalayas as well, because India has also taken cognizance of the fact that there could be future pandemics, endemics, which might be ushered in by prehistoric pathogens, which could be thawing with the layers of ice in both regions. So it's really this sort of a biosecurity argument where you can retrospectively, apply the same concepts in when you're studying the biosecurity angle. So I would really like to mention this one article that my colleague Ruturaj Kovaikar and I wrote back in summer 2021, which we will also link in the show notes. So I think this is one key area where, in fact, the EU, Russia, and India could actually cooperate on. So I think the third pole's biosecurity angle ties in very well with the Arctic.
I totally agree with you, especially because these threats, these biosecurity threats, are already a reality if we consider Russia and the emergence of a known anthrax pathogen that, if I remember well, did not only kill a herd of reindeers, but also a teenage boy. I believe it was in 2013. There are also risks of seeing, for instance, Spanish flu pathogen reemerging from Alaska. So indeed, this fear and this anxiety about this biosecurity risk are real for Arctic countries. And I'm definitely interested to reading your article on the subject.
Sure, sure. So on that note, folks, we'll take a short break. Don't go anywhere.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Advertising is Dead, Varun talks to Naveen Murali. He is the head and VP of marketing at Pepperfry, and together they trace the evolution of the furniture market in India. On Marathi Kirkitun, the Deshmukhs welcome Sania Mane, host of our new Marathi podcast, Akhand Bharat. She shares how she conceptualized the podcast and the story behind presenting history in this way. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshav takes us to a land of unique traditions, Mathi. Find out how they use auspicious occasions to plant trees. On Pulyabazi, Pranay and Saurabh analyze India's current need of the hour, self-reliance or self-interest. And on Smarter with Sid, Siddharth shares two important lessons we can learn from the infamous Oscars incident involving Will Smith, Chris Rock, and, well, a joke and a punch. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on, including the one you're listening to us on now. And also, please do check us out on YouTube. We have a number of channels. They're all available on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey to help us understand you, the listener, better, and how you like our shows, how you respond to the advertising, and so on. We'd really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It's at ivmpodcast.com/survey. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, SBI Life Insurance, India Water Portal, and Jupiter, a digital banking app. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back, folks. We're discussing the Arctic with Alexander. So, Alexander, let's talk about the maritime aspects of the Arctic, specifically the Northern Sea route and the transshipment potential of the NSR. And also, let's talk a bit about China. We haven't actually talked much about China. So, China in 2018, I think 26 January 2018 is when they published their white paper on the matter. And they claimed themselves to be a near Arctic state, which I think is completely a ridiculous claim. And also, let's talk a little bit specifics about Russia's mineral and energy exports for its Arctic region territory. So let's begin with you, man.
Yeah, certainly. So I think I'll combine Russia's mineral and energy export with the maritime aspect of the Arctic, and especially on the matter of the Northern Sea Route. Just to go back in time, we have to remember that using the Northeast Passage is an old practice that has been used by the Soviets right after the revolution for humanitarian purposes. And the equivalent of the Northern Sea Route during the Soviet era reached its peak in 1986, when 6.5 million of goods transited through this Northern Sea Route. With the collapse of the Soviet Union came the collapse of the transit, if I may say, which has been evaluated to 1.5 million of tons in 1996. This number stagnated through the early 2000s. However, we started witnessing a sharp increase in both cargo and traffic in the last decade. From 2012 to 2021, cargo has grown from 2 million to 35 million tons. Of course, let's be real, that's not enough to compete with the Suez Canal nor the Malacca Strait. And true, the passage, it's piracy-free. That's one of the advantages of the passage. It is shorter, it is piracy-free, and the warming weather improves the icebreaking techniques. These new icebreaking techniques as well considerably help in the establishment of a transport route. However, we have to keep in mind that the passage will remain dangerous for the decades to come, because even with a melting ice pack, we'll still see growlers, we'll still see pieces of ice floating around in the Arctic and on the passage, and with the potential of damaging the ships in a remote region with only few rescue capabilities. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. So this is why Russia keeps investing in the construction of icebreakers and nuclear-powered ones. And alongside the construction of the Yamal LNG site, for instance, in 2016, it's a station. It's both a station of a site of extraction of gas and of liquefaction that can directly export it to clients in Europe or Asia. And alongside with the construction of this site on the Yamal Peninsula, 15 icebreaker LNG tankers have been built as well. As for the Yamal LNG 2 site, this time we should be ready in 2024, considering the consequences of the Ukraine war of Russian businesses. So when you consider this Yamal LNG 2 site, the number of these icebreaking tankers should go up to 21. So most of the transit occur in the summer and the fall, but these specialized vessels can travel all year round. And what this recent increase of transit we're witnessing demonstrates is that southern countries want to improve their direct connection to oil and gas exploitation sites. If we look at the studies released in 2018 by COSCO Shipping, so a Chinese company, which is also the world's fourth largest shipping company, transiting through the Arctic in the summer is profitable for its shorter route, despite the higher costs of insurance. So to summarize, the development of the Northern Sea Route in the Northeast Passage illustrates how globalized the Arctic already is. Not only because such development could not happen if non-Arctic nations were not interested by the Arctic, but also because the infrastructures built in the Russian Arctic, like the Yamal LNG sites, require the engineering expertise of other nations, like France or China. And this is the perfect transition to China and its claim. So if we study this claim and what became before this 2018 white paper where China claimed to be a near Arctic state, we have to consider that China's arrival in the Arctic went through several phases of penetration or infiltration of the region, thanks to a relatively subtle mix of international and national policies. So Chinese scientists started to roam the Arctic in the 1980s. We can mention Shanghai's Polar Research Institute that opened in 1989. And a year later, we can also mention this event where the Chinese flag was planted at the North Pole by a Chinese scientist. So as a side note, and as a side note as well, we can mention that 10 years later, in 1999, when China organized its first Arctic expedition with its first ice-breaking vessel, research vessel, the Shuelong, so the Snow Dragon, this first expedition went very bad. It was supposed to go through the Northwest Passage, so in Canada's water, or what Canada considers water. And what happened is that the authorities did not either did not receive or were not informed about this passage of the Shuelong, so of the Chinese icebreaker. And so the Canadian Coast Guard seized the icebreaker and found what they called, and I'm quoting, an excessive amount of arms on board. So this is the bad omen of the Chinese attempt to reach the Arctic and be more present in the region, already starting from the origin. In 2009, we can see again this defeat from a Chinese point of view with the rejection of China's application to the AC, to the Arctic Council. This defeat led the country to change its approach for a multiplication of bilateral initiatives, which this time allowed Beijing to become an observer in 2013, at the same time as India. However, through considerable efforts and funding, China stood in 2016 as the 7th scientific publishing country on Arctic matters and has just now opened joint research stations in every Arctic countries of Europe, where equipment could be used for both research and intelligence activities. Then in 2018, meaning 5 years after being accepted as an observer, member of the Arctic Council, we had this famous white paper with this concept of the near Arctic state. However, what we didn't see beforehand is the publication between 2014 and 2017 of several, they were called blue papers, that were preparing this conceptualization of an internationally shared Arctic. This doctrine would not have been possible without 2 decades of scientific research and illustrates the concept of science for diplomacy that will eventually change China's situation of a rule follower to a rule maker. So through its work at the Arctic Council's working group, China hopes to not be just a rule follower, but also a rule maker, and so contribute to the construction of the future Arctic governance. Of course, we can mention more physical attempts to gain a foothold in the Arctic, like technological cooperation with Finland and Russia. We can mention the free trade agreement with Iceland. We can also mention the purchase offers of lands in Iceland, Russia, and Greenland for the opening of new resorts, quote unquote, that would somehow replace former military bases, for instance, in Greenland. And this has been strongly rejected by these countries. So we saw these attempts. We saw some rejects for Chinese initiatives, but slowly but surely, China is still rising as an Arctic power just by its investing capabilities. Between 2012 and 2017, it has been estimated that China has invested the equivalent of $450 billion in the Arctic region. It's huge. It is the equivalent of 1 year of the Arctic GDP, or the regional GDP. So just from this investment capacity, just from this financial power, China can already be considered as an Arctic power. That is facing defeats, of course, but still. And now there is something that is extremely interesting, and that is China's internal policies and its attempt to build an Arctic identity at home. An Arctic identity, and I would even say an Arctic soft power that would radiate from China itself. So geographically speaking, just like you said, saying that China is a near Arctic state can be indeed considered as ridiculous because it doesn't have any polar territory. However, its northernmost province of the Heilongjiang, where is located its northernmost county of Mohe, is more and more represented as a near Arctic region for its similarities with Arctic lands. There is also this boasting of an Arctic Chinatown, for instance, in this region in Mohe. So Mohe County is indeed only 1,500 kilometers from the Arctic Circle, but only 500 kilometers away from the Russian region of Yakutia, that is generally considered as an extended Arctic land. So with these internal and national Chinese policies about cultivating this Arctic identity at home with the Heilongjiang province and the Mohe County, China is starting to say that it has territories that are more Arctic-like than real Arctic countries like Norway and Iceland. And we can see an instrumentalization, a use of these indigenous people, these minorities that China has in this Heilongjiang province, like the Evenki, who are reindeer herders. We can see that China is more and more including them into its foreign policy. For instance, they paid for their inclusion to the Association of World Reindeer Herders. And so, in a provocative way, we could end this reflection by just considering the expression of Middle East that is used to consider the western side of the Eurasian continent. So why not consider a near Arctic geographical area as well.
Indeed. And, to end this conversation on, let's talk about the current situation in Ukraine, because honestly, no matter if it's the Arctic or any other region of the world, we would really have to take that into account. So since the Arctic Council, except for Russia, every other member has suspended its cooperation there, its engagement there right now, and it's pretty much in limbo. So is it a return to hard security in the region?
So, well, like we said before, all actors know that the region is geographically unsuited for open conflict. When we talk about hard security, I believe that hard security never truly left the Arctic, and hard security governments as well never truly left the Arctic. And the problem does not come from a lack of platforms, a lack of hard security governments, but rather an unstable Russian contribution. The Georgia and Ukraine crisis of 2008 and 2014 did harm these platforms. So since the 90s, we had the POMO joint annual exercises between Norway and Russia. These ended in 2014. The Arctic Chiefs of Defense Staff meeting, founded in 2012 and gathering the 8 Arctic states, was simply suspended after 2014. The last two standing fora that we have, the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, founded in 2011, that also includes European countries, but it ceased to invite Russia after 2014. We also have the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which is truly the last one, the last government's forum on hard security that still works. It was founded by the US when it was chairing the Arctic Council. This platform is discrete but essential to face the most likely security risk the Arctic will experience due to rising maritime activities. I'm talking about shipping routes, fishing, and tourism. These are the main risks for the Arctic, to my understanding. This Arctic Coast Guard Forum is still up and running as we speak, which is great news considering the recent interruption of the Arctic Council works. The last word, I would say, would be about these Arctic governments being flexible enough to be able to punish Russia after the 2014, while still including it in the Arctic Council. By the way, the Arctic Council was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, just nominated. However, now we clearly notice that Arctic governance is not perfect. We have this pause of the Arctic Council Working Group. We have this isolation of Russia. My personal fear, as someone who started to work on Arctic governance in 2016, is that the end of this crisis, the exit of this crisis, of this pause, is still unclear, if not absent. When should the talk resume? Will it be after the Ukraine war? Will it be after the Russia's chairmanship of the Council? Will it be after Putin has left the Kremlin? We do not know. And again, I want to highlight the fact that Arctic governments and cooperation truly started as a region when the Western countries agreed to an enhanced dialogue with Moscow. Let's end up with this question: how are we supposed to cooperate in search and rescue situations without Russia, without the country that owns 50% of the Arctic? The most important environmental work of the Council has happened in the Northwest Russia. So how do we study permafrost without Russia, for instance? Hopefully, we will all remember that motto about the Arctic region: high north, low tension.
Indeed. And on that note, folks, we'll call it a wrap. If you like today's discussion, do check out all past and future episodes of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Ladies, I'm sure you will relate to it if I say that we are constantly busy with work, studies, cooking, and what not. And amidst all of this, we often forget an important element that needs our desperate attention: finance. So here we are, bringing to you SBI Life Presents A Sip of Finance, a women-exclusive podcast where we will teach you how to manage personal finances in a simple and straightforward way with your host, Priyanka Acharya, a finance expert who's been in the industry for 14 plus years. And not just in English, but in 7 more languages. So tune in every Tuesday for fresh episodes on the IVM Podcast Network and all major podcast streaming platforms.
We face 100 dilemmas every day while raising our children and nurturing our families. Why not let science help us make informed decisions to solve our dilemmas? Hi, I'm Devi Shobha.
And I'm Meghna. We host Big Talk About Tiny Humans, where we will help you unpack challenges around parenting and your child's development.
And more importantly, we will equip you with research-backed strategies that you can readily act on.
Tune in to our podcast every Wednesday on the IVM Podcasts app, website, or your favorite podcast platforms.